Good afternoon. My name is Robert Tresson, and I have the privilege to serve as ADL's Vice President of the Western Division and the Regional Director of our New England office, which is based in Boston. Thank you for joining us today. Good morning to those of you who are joining us from the West Coast, and good afternoon to everyone else from the rest of the country. As you all know, anti-Semitism exists across the political spectrum, both ideologically and socially. Other workshops at our Never Is Now virtual summit have examined manifestations of anti-Semitism that appear primarily on the extreme right. Indeed, people often say that the real problem with anti-Semitism is on the far right, and ADL's own data, supported by government data, shows that 95% of extremist murders in the past 10 years were committed by the right. So why should we bother with anti-Semitism on the left? And there's a few reasons for this. Anti-Semitism does not remain quarantined to a particular sector of the ideological spectrum because ideas cross-pollinate. They always have, and they will continue to do so. For the last several years, maybe even decades, American Jews have been one of, if not the most reliably liberal demographics in the country. And they've traditionally been very welcomed in progressive spaces. However, in the last few years, we've seen incidences that raise questions about anti-Semitism in those spaces. Today, we're going to examine how anti-Semitism manifests itself on the left and in progressive spaces, including through the prism of Israel, and discuss ways to build awareness of this bias and ensure that all spaces are inclusive of Jews and free of hate, and why it's important for Jews to be working in this space. To delve into this topic, I'm pleased to be joined by a stellar group of activists and practitioners. Rabbi Sharon Brous is the senior and founding rabbi of IHRA and an activist in multi-faith justice work in Los Angeles and around the country. Rabbi Brous is joining us from Los Angeles, and you can follow her on Twitter at Sharon Brous. My colleague Seth Brisk is the director of ADL's Central Pacific region, which covers Northern California, Utah, and Hawaii. Seth is joining us today from San Francisco, and you can follow him on Twitter at ADL_SF. Tema Smith is a writer, educator, and Jewish community builder. She's currently the director of professional development at 18 Doors and a contributing columnist at The Forward. Tema is joining us today from Toronto, Canada, and you can follow her on Twitter at Tema Smith. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'd like to kick off our discussion with Tema. And when we're talking about anti-Semitism in progressive spaces, Tema, can you set the stage for us? When we're talking about the progressive spaces, what spaces are we actually speaking about? Let's sort of set the platform to get us going in this discussion, so we all have some common understanding of what's the space that we're talking about.
Sure. So, of course, progressive space is a very broad term. We're talking about spaces within the Jewish community, spaces outside the Jewish community, spaces where Jews show up in Jewish organizational partnerships, and everything in between, spaces where we aren't. But basically, what we're talking about in many ways are spaces dedicated to social change in various ways. Whether that's racial justice spaces, whether that is LGBTQ advocacy spaces. But I think the central tenets of these spaces are sort of a lean towards the left politically, and some sort of an advocacy position or a protest philosophy of social change towards greater equity, anti-racism, gender equity, inclusion, all of those sorts of spaces. This is a very broad field, of course. And so, one of the things that I always think about when I have this conversation is that when we talk about progressive spaces, we're actually talking about a lot of places that don't look alike to each other, and have very different sort of ins and outs of ways to engage within them, and broader sort of operating philosophies. So just want to sort of set the stage there that we are talking about many things at once when we talk about progressive spaces.
Rabbi Brous, you're a national leader in this space, both on the importance of being in the space and actually overcoming the challenges. And just listening to Tema, we know that it's a broad space. There's a lot happening, and there are a lot of different beliefs and different people and groups in those spaces. Tell us a little bit, just sort of get the juices flowing here on like what's been some of your experience, what have you seen, and what are some of the biggest challenges in this space?
Thank you. Thank you, Robert, for your question. I want to just take a step back, if I can, and offer for us a little bit of context for the conversation on growing anti-Semitism in progressive spaces. And first, what I want to say is that anti-Semitism on the rise across the United States and is not accidental, and it's not coincidental in this moment. It's really important for us to start this conversation by recognizing that cultural norms have been set and are being fueled right now by politicians whose political power relies on dividing the population and generating fear. That's how they maintain power. That's how they profit. And they've created now a set of cultural norms that have led to a real vulnerability for Jews across the board. It has led to the embrace of increasingly radical ideas and views we've seen now as white nationalists have really moved into the mainstream. And isolating Jews is part of the strategy that those political figures are using in order to divide the population and generate fear. Because when you can drive a wedge between Jews and those who Jews tend to ally themselves with in the political space, which traditionally and historically has very much been the left, then it makes it much easier to target Black and brown people. It makes it easier once you're able to undercut that kind of historic connection or alliance between the Jewish community and movements for justice. That's the context that I want to invite us to consider the growth of anti-Semitism in progressive spaces or on the left in the midst of, because I'm sad to say it's actually working, that it's become increasingly normative in the movements for justice to see Jews as the other. And it's not accidental. This is a manipulation, and it's working, and it's very painful for those of us who find ourselves in those spaces. I just spent some time yesterday with a bunch of Jewish college students who were talking about how when they show up at events to support the rights of refugees and asylum seekers at our border, they're often told that if they don't disavow Israel at the door, that they don't have that they're not welcome in those spaces. It's very painful for us as people who identify and see ourselves as those working toward justice. It also makes us feel even more vulnerable and even more isolated, especially in light of the growing violent anti-Semitism that we're seeing across the country. And it's really destructive to the left itself, because we end up spending our time distracted by this kind of internal fight rather than really focusing on what the really critical work of building a true, just, multiracial democracy is today. So when Jews are scapegoated in this space, and when people in the movement spaces on the left, in progressive spaces, buy into it, we're actually buying into the power dynamic that those who are in power have handed to us as a way of advancing their own objectives, which are contrary to and undermine the agenda of those in progressive spaces.
So you set a great context here, and there are things that are happening almost in real time. So let me just jump to Seth, because you mentioned campus. And Seth, I mean, you cover a region that's traditionally been, at the forefront of progressive activism. And I know just yesterday there was a BDS vote in San Francisco at San Francisco State University. So like, how do you navigate this space? And also, as Rabbi Brous is saying, this sort of isolating of Jews. and the, particularly like, people in this space that suddenly are almost pushed to a corner when actually they want to be standing up for the right thing.
Thank you. It's an important question, and it's true that this week we saw a BDS resolution that was approved at San Francisco State University by the student government. And what we see in the discussion is we witnessed people outside of the Jewish community trying to define Jewish identity for Jewish students, trying to exclude Jewish students from their own community, from their own identity as Jews, but also from their own identity as progressives. And so it's it's sort of this double-edged sword that the students are confronting, and that many times people will confront when they are dealing with expressions of anti-Semitism within a progressive space. So it leads me to think about something that Professor Deborah Lipstadt has said when talking about anti-Semitism. She says that if you're not talking about anti-Semitism from your own home, within your own house, within your own political home, then you're not really being serious about the issue. Well, as a necessary precursor to acting and thinking in that way, you need to be in that space. You need to have an authentic voice in that space. And if your voice is being silenced, if you're being denied access to that opportunity, then you're not going to be able to be effective. So if you are somebody who is deeply concerned about anti-Semitism, it's important that we have Jewish voices in progressive spaces who can speak truth and talk about the ways in which anti-Semitism manifests and affects them directly. And at the same time, if you are a progressive, you need to be able to speak out and to be able to have that opportunity to have that voice. So if we're going to be honest about where anti-Semitism is, where it's coming from, and how it's manifesting, we have to be able to speak honestly about it. And the other thing that we've noticed is that those progressive voices from within the community, and think about your own relationships with people, those are the most authentic, those are the most effective voices in confronting anti-Semitism. So if you are concerned about anti-Semitism, you need to be in relationship. You need to be in an honest relationship and in dialogue and in community with those other voices in order to be effective in speaking out against the ways in which it may manifest.
Well, Rabbi Brous, you mentioned the students that you just met with. And, I mean, that's the story you just told is something that I think many of us at ADL increasingly hear from not just in the work life, but people that, in our own families with students. Like, what's your advice to those students who, are on campus and they end up being the ones who are being isolated, and I think probably their voices are amongst the most important.
Well, I want to echo something that Seth just brought. The first and most important thing for us to know and state and reinforce is that it is in our shared interest to work together to counter the machinery of division and fear, that the great vision of collective liberation cannot happen if Jews are not a part of that story and if Jews are oppressed or sidelined or marginalized. So I want to say that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in progressive movements to help people have a deeper and more complex analysis of and understanding of anti-Semitism. And that work actually has to start in the Jewish community. There's so much that we are learning now about anti-Semitism that we did not even understand before. And so the first thing we have to do is we have to educate ourselves and grow in our own understanding of it. And then Jews who are in the movement need to be willing to not run away when we hear hints of or echoes of or even really loud amplification of anti-Semitic messages. We don't walk away from the work of racial justice or economic justice. We have to lean in and we have to reinforce for ourselves and others that our oppressions are tied up in one another's, that our liberation is tied up in one another. We have to help our allies and our colleagues understand and take seriously anti-Semitism. We've all been asked over the course of the last decade or so to really interrogate our own internalized anti-Black racism in this country. That is one of the great calls of the moment that we're living in right now. It's part of this massive moral awakening that's, thank God, finally beginning to happen in the United States. We also need to interrogate internalized forms of other hatreds, internalized transphobia, homophobia, internalized anti-Semitism. And when we start to look at it and ask questions about it, we start to learn about the very particular nature of generational trauma for Jews, which is different from the kind of trauma that comes from other forms of racism. Because for Jews, what often has happened throughout history is that we do achieve some measure of success, of acceptance, even wealth and power and privilege in many societies, and it doesn't protect us the moment history turns. And we see this story repeated again and again throughout Jewish history, and it's built into our kind of collective memory of who we are, the notion of eternal vulnerability. And it's real. And so we have to take that seriously, and we have to educate toward that, because other people, especially folks in the movement, look at us and they don't understand why we feel so vulnerable. They say, look at your houses, look at your cars, look at your college savings. Why this isn't about you. You're come from a place of privilege. But for us, understanding our own historical and generational trauma, we absolutely understand that anti-Semitism works in a different way. And so we have to share that with people. And if we walk away and just write op-eds and preach sermons about how the world doesn't understand the Jews and there's no room for me in Black Lives Matter because one Black person once made a comment that was anti-Semitic, then we have no space to stretch open the boundaries of understanding. It's really critical that we stay in the movement and that we stay in the work. And I want to just add one more thing, Robert, which is I have seen over the course of time, many in the Jewish community make the same mistake or engage in the same overt act of cruelty toward the Black community that we always complain of when it happens in the Jewish community, which is this is the rule of from the one to the many. That if one Jew behaves badly, that all Jews are therefore painted with the same brush. We do the same thing in the Black community. We hear a comment from one Black rapper or football player or comedian, for example, and then we make assumptions about the movement for Black lives. We make assumptions about the Black community having problems with anti-Semitism, and we must stop doing this. We are doing violence to each other and to ourselves when we engage in this kind of discourse. It's really painful. But if we walk away, if we use these comments as excuses to walk away from the work, we are only feeding the machinery of fear and division, which is doing so much damage to our country and really around the world.
Thank you. Tema, you're definitely not someone who runs from this, and you're engaged daily. And I know that there are always risks when you're actually working within the movement, within the space, and you call things out. So tell us a little bit about, you've taken risk from your own perspective in calling out anti-Semitism, and you haven't run from it. You've actually been engaged in trying to get to the other side. How's that? Tell us a little bit about what it's been like for you and some of those struggles, and where it's been and how it's been successful.
Sure. So, lately, the majority of my work has been actually inside our Jewish community, trying to look at some of the ways in which, like Rabbi Brous just spoke about, some of the ways in which our own fears actually divide us from necessary work that then hurts also Jews. So, for myself, I'm a mixed race person. My father is Black. And so, if we run away from Black Lives Matter, we're also running away from Black Jews. And so I just want to clarify that a lot of my work now is really sort of in that, takes on that lens. But, the majority of my life, I've been in progressive spaces. I've heard things come up numerous times. It took a while. I will own it took a while to develop maybe an unfortunately thick skin. But my bottom line has always been that we are more successful in changing opinion when we are in deep relationship with people around a table than when we refuse to step into the building. You can imagine where can you best change minds? Yelling and refusing to engage until somebody drops their previously held beliefs and opinions, or sitting down and saying, how did we get here? Why do you believe the things that you believe? Here are counterexamples. Here's analysis. And that work for me happens within the Jewish community and sort of more broadly. And there are tons of people within our Jewish community who are doing that work every single day in spaces that you might not expect, and from people who, I will also say, get painted within the Jewish community, or when I say the Jewish community, I mean very sort of mainstream Jewish community voices who actually will paint our fellow Jews who are in progressive spaces who might have some of the opinions and beliefs that we hold to be anti-Semitic, but people are in those spaces trying to educate and do work to move people along. And so I think, there has to be some understanding as well within the Jewish community that just because you see a Jew at a table with people who you might think are anti-Semitic, that doesn't mean that that person is not doing very hard work to explain our history, explain our fears of vulnerability, explain the very real trauma that our community has faced, and really try and build bridges that have been burnt down a little bit by a refusal to engage.
So, but let me ask either Tim or I guess anyone could answer this, but you sort of touched on the Black Lives Matter movement, and I know we this is a hot topic. We get a lot of questions, emails about this. Like, how do we almost overcome this perception that you laid it out for us, Rabbi Brous, but like, what's your best advice? I would say within the Jewish community for getting past this.
I think we have to understand that the foundational sin of this country is the sin of genocide and white supremacy. It's the sin of the kidnapping of millions of human beings from Africa and bringing them to this country where they were forced to endure and suffer hundreds of years of degradation and oppression and destruction of families and destruction of bodies, which then led to the criminalization of Black people in this country after the end of enslavement, to Jim Crow and the era of racial terror, which then evolved into mass incarceration, voter disenfranchisement, all of the ways that we're seeing now that racism persists in our country. And what Black Lives Matter and what many in the struggle for racial justice are trying to do is lift up a different vision of what's possible in this country, that the vision of a true multiracial democracy. And in order for us to actually get there, we as a country have to take responsibility for what has happened in the past and for the ways that many, many people over the course of many generations have actually been complicit, even if they themselves were not responsible for engaging in acts of terror or acts of violence that were overtly racist, that many people in this country have benefited from these systems of oppression. That's what Black Lives Matter is asking us to do, okay? So in my understanding of the movement and in my understanding of racial justice movements more generally speaking, it's actually a hopeful movement because it's a movement that believes that it's possible for us to do better and that it's possible for us to build a society in which all of us can live in justice, with equity, with equality, and in a society that's really rooted in love. That's something that is absolutely in alignment, not only with my core Jewish values, with my understanding of Torah. And so what does our Jewish community need to do? We have to understand that even though many Jews who are in this country today, many Jews will say that we came here, that our grandparents or great-grandparents came to this country either fleeing pogroms, fleeing Nazis, or fleeing dictatorship, and came to this country and worked hard and built our own lives and have nothing to do with the history of racial injustice in America, that in fact, all of us have to be a part of building a more just society here. This is our work too. This is a responsibility of our Jewish community. I actually believe that the Jewish community needs to be at the forefront of the move for reparations for Black Americans. I believe that our Jewish community needs to be at the forefront of the move for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in this country, because we know and understand how absolutely essential that movement for reparations was post-Holocaust, and what it meant to our Jewish community and family. Not only the checks, which I know a lot of Holocaust survivors who received those checks donated them to tzedakah or refused the money altogether. It's not even so much about the money as it is about the acknowledgement, the recognition that something truly wrong happened here and that we are going to start a new and different chapter now. That's core to our Torah and core to the way that our Jewish community functions. And it's essential that we're part of the movement to advance that conversation in this country in this time.
So I know, Tema, you wanted to jump in, but I just want to recognize the word that you used, which was love. And I think that that's like a really important concept for us to keep in mind, because I know as Jews, it's so important to who we are. And then, also just the issue of reparations. For those who may not know, California is actually leading the way in across the United States right now with a whole study. I'm not sure the exact language, but I know that there is now a study that's underway in California to start to examine how this would actually work. Tema?
Yeah, I just want to say very quickly, and then return to what I was thinking of, that one of the things that was just such a meaningful moment for me was at the Union for Reform Judaism Biennial in Chicago in December, which now feels like light years ago. But the movement actually brought to the floor a resolution in support of reparations, and being on the floor when that resolution passed. As somebody, my family's from the Bahamas, so our slave history is not on the ground of the United States, but of course there is a slave history in our family. It just felt just so moving, and really thinking about my Jewish identity and being there. I like can't say enough. I'm getting misty thinking about how I felt in that moment. But one of the things, I just had the really great pleasure of leading a 6-week-long course here for about 15 young-ish Jewish adults, talking about anti-Semitism, talking about our roles in social justice spaces. And what became really clear in the sort of first moment of this course was that what there really was a desperate need for amongst these people, who are all people who show up in spaces, was for us to have a space together to work through the questions of how do Jews fit into this? How does anti-Semitism fit into this? What is anti-Semitism? What are the permutations? And everyone and myself included, sort of landed very quickly on a realization that we hadn't been given space to really do that before. That there was sort of a general sort of assumption that anti-Semitism exists and it's easy to recognize and it's easy to spot and it all comes from the same source and from the same analysis. And actually, as we started working through, when we did a week looking at the questions of are Jews white, and we did a week looking at questions raised by specifically Black Jews within the Jews of color community about our own Jewish community. We spent some time understanding language around intersectionality and anti-racism, but all of it done through the lens of understanding where we as Jews of varying backgrounds fit in when we step into spaces dedicated to social justice. And it ended last night, and this is a class that wraps up at 9:00 over Zoom, and at 10:30 I still had people on Zoom sort of processing, and it really got me thinking about what would it look like to create spaces like that more broadly. I mean, this is 15 people in Toronto. Like, this was not exactly a broad sort of program. And it was, and we had a great opportunity to do this. But what would it look like to give Jews spaces to work through this stuff, so that when we do show up and encounter something, our immediate response isn't sort of the sort of fight or flight response, which I think just to validate, that's a very valid response when you're faced with hateful comment or something that sort of undermines your identity in some way. That is a human response to have. And so we need to give people the tools, I think, to get beyond fight or flight and actually to be able to know themselves, understand all of the core issues, enough to be able to engage in meaningful and well thought out ways, so that we can actually advance the conversation.
Never underestimate the power of one person. And so 15 people in Toronto can make a huge difference. And I know that people that we're working with and that are part of ECAR can make a huge difference. Seth, I want to turn to you for a second, just shift gears a little bit, because one of the big issues in California recently has been the ethnic studies curriculum. It's really, I think, been designed to be a progressive curriculum, but it's also brought on a lot of division. It's it's the curriculum really. There has been issues with allegations of anti-Semitism in early drafts that some people saw as problematic, and I think there's also been some divisions, both within the community, the Jewish community, and broader. How have you been able to navigate this? And I'll just sort of say for everyone else in the country, this is actually a really important topic, because in the same way that reparations may be starting in California, it's coming east. I know that there are already discussions about the California model of ethnic studies curriculum in a number of Northeast states.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. It's an important question. I wanted to, if I could, just remind folks tuning in today that about the moment in which we're operating. I mean, again, if you look at ADL's audit of anti-Semitic incidents, last year was the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents that we've recorded in over 4 decades of tallying this information. The FBI just released its hate crime statistics for last year this week. And once again, we saw a double-digit percentage increase in the number of hate crimes targeting the Jewish community. And again, Jews were targeted more often than all other religious groups combined. So we're at a very important moment, and if I can be a little bit cynical and self-interested, I think it's vitally important that we look at the ways in which we need to be responding to this, and we cannot afford to be absent from any place where we think that we can advance the cause of confronting and fighting anti-Semitism. So that's vitally important, and that includes in the classroom. So you talked about ethnic studies. This is a movement, as you said, which is already taking hold. There are already many students that take ethnic studies as a matter of course. The proposal in California is to make this a mandatory subject in high school. The California State University system already put into place a requirement for graduation to study ethnic studies. The reason for this is for us to be able to better understand one another. We see this in lots of other ways, that education about other groups or about other events can help students to think critically, to relate to one another in a better way, and to improve the way in which they understand differences among one another. We see that in the Holocaust education that we develop. I think people in the Jewish community intuit that they understand that Holocaust education provides that kind of a positive message and can be helpful in dealing with a lot of other issues. The same thing is true for ethnic studies. The concern is that there are some from within the ethnic studies movement who have seen this as an opportunity to advance a political agenda. And we don't want that to happen. We have pushed back very hard. We want to make sure that as people recognize the moment of rising hate in this country, the rise of hate crimes in this country that have taken place, particularly over the last several years, that they understand that the Jewish story is an important part of that. That the anti-Semitism that's taking place is an important part of that. And so it's another indication of it is critically and vital that we not absent ourselves from any place, and that people from whatever side of the political agenda or whatever identification you might have, that they don't necessarily take the Jewish community for granted, that they need to earn our respect and earn our involvement, and that we in turn need to do the same in order to be a vital and an authentic partner and an authentic voice in that space. So we saw in ethnic studies the need to have, it defined along with other forms of hatred, anti-Semitism. We need to be able to acknowledge that ethnic studies is inherently a political movement. It's not simply an educational enterprise. And therefore, we need to acknowledge the politics that are involved. And in order to be effective in the ways that we were, to eliminate, as we did, from an earlier draft of the ethnic studies model curriculum, references that were overtly anti-Semitic or had extreme anti-Israel bias. The way that we did that was we talked about it from a place of authenticity. ADL had endorsed the concept of ethnic studies very early on, and so our voice was seen as authentic and credible. And we were seen as someone who wanted to make sure that this was the best possible course of study that we could find, to ensure that it was of a high quality, that it was pedagogically sound, and that it would achieve its goals. And in so doing, we were able to influence the debate so that we could remove those aspects of the curriculum that did contain anti-Semitism, that did contain notions of extreme anti-Israel bias, and move forward and get it back on track to where it needs to be.
I'll just sort of, I think it's sort of worth noting that on Monday, the FBI released its latest hate crime reports, and 2019 was the deadliest year for hate crimes. I think it was 54 murders in 2019, and we also saw a dramatic increase in hate crimes directed against Jews, and consistent with all previous years, the highest category of people who were targeted was based upon race. So, it's also a reminder that we're all in this together, even though there are these sort of differences in arguments that go on. I wanna jump to a current event which really just happened earlier today. And that was Secretary Pompeo made a announcement during a visit to Israel, and he's still in Israel because it just happened within hours. That the current administration at the White House is identifying the BDS movement as "quote unquote" anti-Semitic, and that will undoubtedly have repercussions. I think for the progressive movement, because they're going to hold accountable, details not fully known yet, organizations that at least are in some way labeled or identified as supporting BDS. It's not clear. It's not clear like what that standard is. Rabbi Brous, like I would imagine in the spaces that you work and the people that you are actively engaged in, and I'm sure Seth on the ADL side, this is going to have implications. How do you, how what's your response to this? Like, how do you react, and how do we navigate through it?
Well, I think we have to get really clear in this battle around BDS on a couple of things. The first thing is that Israel, like all countries, should actually be held accountable for human rights violations. And I say that as a person who travels to Israel once or twice a year. My family lives in Israel. I feel a very deep love and lifelong affinity and connection to Israel. Israel should be held accountable for human rights violations. Boycotts are a legally protected form of speech, and anti-BDS legislation is an attack on that freedom of speech, and it creates a backlash against the Jewish community and against the state of Israel. So two things we should note. One, BDS has been fairly ineffective in changing Israeli policy. And two, labeling BDS as anti-Semitic or legislating against it has been equally ineffective in slowing the movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I think those are very critical. The next piece of this is that there's, of course, anti-Semitism in the BDS movement. And it's important for us to call it out when we see it. But not all people who support BDS are anti-Semitic. There are many who criticize Israel who are not anti-Semitic and who are looking for legitimate ways to differentiate between, for example, products that come from the settlements and products that come from within Israel, from the other side of the Green Line. And so I want for us to consider, and I'm a person who opposes BDS, many of the people who will be harmed most by Pompeo's latest move, which seems to me to be an effort to make us, the Jewish community, somehow props for his future political ambitions. Many of the people who will be hurt most are actually people who don't even support BDS. A lot of the human rights organizations that are being targeted right now, whether it's Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, Amnesty International, these are all organizations that do not support BDS, and yet they are going to be painted with a broad brush, and they're going to be harmed as a result of this kind of designation. I think it's really important and critical for us to stand up and to speak out against anti-Semitism wherever we see it. But we have to be extremely careful about labeling a boycott movement illegitimate just because we don't like it. And I want to just close by saying that the only way that we're going to actually effectively be able to combat BDS is by working to transform those policies in Israeli society that are causing harm to millions of people, which have led to an international movement to try to address those. I know that's hard for people to hear, and I know it's hard to hear it from a rabbi, but part of the reason that we're seeing and experiencing this rising up of a movement is because we haven't been speaking about it enough within our own Jewish communities. We haven't been demonstrating and leading with a kind of moral outrage when a right-wing ultra-nationalist Israeli government continues to push an aggressive right-wing ultra-nationalist set of policies. If we don't speak out about it within our own Jewish institutions and established Jewish community, so then people feel they have no place to turn other than to a movement which also puts them into a broader tent with some folks who are in fact anti-Semitic. We have to take some responsibility here in our own community. We have to not feed into the moral vacuum and instead stand and speak from our own core values, help Israel live up to its own greatest aspirations articulated in the Declaration of the Establishment of the State, work with Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel in order to work to realize those great aspirations. That's the best way that we can combat the dangers that we see coming from the BDS movement.
Seth, Tema, do you want in on this one?
I'd love to just have a small thought on it, which is one of the interesting things is I'm part of a task force out of the University of Southern California Annenberg campus that is looking at the sort of nexus of issues of anti-Semitism and Israel in American policy. And one of the things that we've been taking a close look at is the use of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism for policy. So, of course, I don't want to sort of detract from the importance of the IHRA definition. In my sort of early days as a Jewish professional, I staffed a task force on Holocaust education that was sort of the Canadian arm of, we were the organization that sent delegates to the IHRA's previous iteration. It had a very long name, the International Task Force, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think this is a very important attempt to define something that is quite nebulous, which is anti-Semitism. But, and even the authors of it agree that it was never meant as a policy piece. It is a framework to guide understanding and analyzing anti-Semitism where it happens, but it leads to, or it can lead to, it doesn't necessarily lead to, what I would say is dangerous mission creep, because the wording in certain places within it is relatively vague. So what it allows, for example, is to label it is vague enough so as to allow the possibility to label organizations that are critical of Israel as anti-Semitic, whether they Jewish organizations who believe in a two-state solution and all of these things could theoretically be labeled anti-Semitic, and I actually do worry that we are reaching that tipping point right now. And I think this is something that's very dangerous. The other thing that I think is great concern to me is that if we don't understand, we were having a little talk amongst ourselves earlier, but that if we don't understand sort of how this is being deployed, that it's actually going to make it very hard for the next administration, should they want to claw any of this back, because it's very hard to then say, by the way, these things, these policies and these statements and these executive orders rather, that were put in place ostensibly to protect Jews went too far, and therefore we want to redeploy them. If you don't know the ins and outs of the issues, that just looks like that the next government will be rolling back protections from anti-Semitism. So we are in, I think, a very tricky point in understanding, I think, how anti-Semitism does appear on the left is part of what we need to do, but also understanding sort of the deeper nuance of what that looks like and how Israel fits into it as a sort of category there, is absolutely necessary for us as Jews who care about social justice, and who care about equity and all of the sort of various progressive areas that Jews are deeply engaged in. Understanding sort of this nuance, I think, is crucial to maintaining our place in doing the work that we want to do towards a more just society.
Just did you want to jump in there, Rabbi
yeah,
Bross?
I mean,
Seth, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Seth.
Go ahead, Seth.
Okay. I just wanted to make a couple of points. One was, I do think that the IHRA definition can be very helpful. In fact, ADL uses it in our guide to anti-Semitism, Anti-Semitism Uncovered, and I commend it to folks who are tuning in today to delve deeper into what is anti-Semitism, how to recognize it, major manifestations, ways that it's changed over time, et cetera, et cetera. So I would encourage people who are attending today to go and look at our guide to anti-Semitism on our website, and that's going to be among the resources that will be provided to people who attend today's session. But I think the definition itself is helpful when it is used as a shield, not as a cudgel. And I think we've saw that, again, let's remember that anti-Semitism should never be politicized. So the IHRA definition was actually adopted by the United States government under the Obama administration, and we should recall that. And while we appreciate the ongoing rejection of BDS, we're concerned that the policy announced today, particularly by Secretary of State Pompeo, could be implemented inappropriately and broadly and serve to politicize the fight. And that's not something that's going to help, or as they say, it's not good for the Jews. And I say that as, first and foremost, ADL has been a stalwart in opposing BDS for quite some time. We've been a leader on this issue, because we understand that it's biased and focused on the demonization and penalization of Israel, rather than working for peace and reconciliation between Palestinians and Israelis, and ultimately achieving a two-state solution. We may have strong disagreements with certain NGOs and their Israel-focused policies, but we oppose, labeling broadly the groups and individuals as anti-Semitic. If you look at ADL over the years, we've been very careful and cautious. We talk about incidents and utterances of anti-Semitism. We very rarely label an individual as anti-Semitic, and that really, you have to do quite a bit. You have to really demonstrate this extreme animus and sustained animus towards the Jewish people to earn that kind of a label and designation on the part of ADL. So, look, the founding goals of the BDS movement, denying Jewish people the universal right of self-determination, which is guaranteed under international law, that in essence is anti-Semitism. Some of these BDS campaigns, they use anti-Semitic tropes and analogies. We saw that again on the campus this week at San Francisco State. Oftentimes the BDS campaigns, they give rise to tensions in communities, again, particularly on university campuses. It can result in, and we've seen it happen many, many times anecdotally, harassment, intimidation of Jews and Israel supporters, and incidents of anti-Semitism that lash out at the Jewish community. So they just create an environment. BDS creates this environment where anti-Semitism can be expressed more freely. Having said all of that, again, there are many individuals that support BDS for a variety of reasons. And these could include good faith efforts to try to improve the lives of Palestinians. But they often don't appreciate the problematic bias in this approach, and the ways in which it's not really constructive, a constructive strategy towards reaching peace and reconciliation. So it was. I want to take this in the best possible light and say I hope that it was done in the best of spirit and for the right reasons. But politicization, broadly applying terms of anti-Semitism, labeling certain groups, that's not going to be helpful. That's not constructive. It's not helpful to Israel ultimately, and it's not helpful to the Jewish people.
Let me just sort of 1.1 the IHRA definition, since we're joined by Tema from Toronto. The province of Ontario did recently adopt it, and here on the East Coast, New York University recently adopted it as a policy. So I think it's definitely the IHRA definition starting to gain a lot more attention. We've gotten a bunch of questions that people have put in, and one of them is actually very related to this. I'll just read the question that someone who's listening and watching typed in. What can Jews on campus and elsewhere do to engage and be part of the progressive movement if they are being cut out of it and kept out of the conversation? So someone's looking for some advice here on actually how to be in the space. Who wants to take that one on? Well, we have a moment of silence here.
Well,
who's got some advice?
I'm happy to offer a couple of concrete pieces of advice. One is, again, I would commend to this person to go to the ADL website. We have a number of resources available for students. In particular, Hate Uncycled within our educational resources offers some guidance to students, activists, and also university administrators and policymakers about how to prepare for and deal with different aspects of hate that may visit the campus. So it's sort of a broad-based approach. It looks at it in a holistic way. So you want to involve yourself and build those relationships, be in coalition, be your authentic self in that space. Don't let other people define who you are. Don't let other people try to dictate to you what your Jewish identity is, or what your, in this case, if it is, progressive identity may be. That you have as much of a right to be able to assert yourself in that conversation. And when you're authentically in that conversation, then you'll have the ability to be able to influence it. So there are other resources as well on the ADL website that deal with some of these specific issues. Think, Plan, Act is another one of our guides that offers some ideas for how students might be able to respond and deal with some of these issues. But I would say, don't back down. You are committed to your Jewish identity and your progressive identity, and I don't think that you need to sacrifice either one, and you shouldn't be forced to do that.
Thanks, Seth. Tema, we're starting to run low on time here, but what might be your advice for leaders and advocates and activists who are in progressive space, but who also criticize Israel in their work, but at the same time they want it to be a welcoming place for Jews within the movement? How can they create an inclusive environment so the Jews who are both progressive and Zionist can make their voice heard and actually have an impact? I would imagine either Tema or Rabbi Brous, but let's go to Tema first.
That's a hard question, but I think one of the biggest sort of things that I can think of instantly is I think that there is a broad cast. The word Zionism has come to mean it means many things, and it's not always understood to mean many things. And I'll just relay a story. I can't remember what I tweeted about, but I tweeted about something about Palestinians and rights and something. And somebody said to me, on that, somebody said to me, wow, I had no idea that Zionists could think like this. And I thought to myself, well, I've always thought like this, and I would say this is the majority opinion. So I think understanding that there are many ways for people who identify as Zionists, there are many opinions within that sort of tent. That's hard, because I think there's also internal Jewish communal politics about who we talk to about what and when we discuss various aspects of Israel and things like that. So I think really it's understanding and not immediately casting sort of this nebulous political concept of Zionism as the immediate enemy, and sort of understanding that it actually is a very broad concept that encapsulates huge amounts of politics. And it's not a term that I think should be bandied around as easily as it is right now.
Thank you. We have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to give Rabbi Brous sort of the last word. Happy to have you sort of answer that question, but in the remaining minutes, Rabbi Brous, I want us to end with some hope and inspiration, and I think that goes to the rabbinic expert on our panel. So feel free to finish up on that question. But what I'd really want to end on is some inspiration from you on how do we keep the faith and find unity when there's division in the country. I think we all know that. But as we're talking about today, there's also division within the space, and there's division within our own community. And I think we need a little bit of that love message that you referred to earlier, and that inspiration to get us to the other side.
Well, thank you for that, Robert. One thing I do want to add, and just make sure that people know about this as a resource. My friend and my colleague, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who's extraordinary in many ways, wrote an incredible piece in the Washington Post, I think about a year or two ago, that offers some guidelines for how to distinguish between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And it's incredibly thoughtful. And I just lift that up. You should find the article and read it. But she's very clear on laying out some of the ways that language is typically now used in the mainstream that indicates a kind of problem, not with Israeli policy, but with Jews. And it's helpful because I think that sometimes people might use this language and perhaps they don't even recognize what's at the heart of it. So please take the time and go look at this. I found it incredibly helpful, and I think that you will as well. On the question of hope, I'll say a couple of things. One, I believe that there's been a tension throughout Jewish history between really two poles of understanding who we are with regards to the rest of the world. And so on one hand, we have believed for many generations that we are Am Levadad Yishkon. We are a nation that is separate and apart, that will never be fully accepted, will never be fully integrated into society. And therefore, we have to learn how to function and how to live and how to defend ourselves, because the world really won't ever fully understand us. On the other side, there's this pull toward a kind of more universalist understanding of who the Jew is in the course of human history. This idea that lo tov heyot adam levado, that it's not good for a person to be alone in the world, that part of being this vibrant, living community means that we're a part of the waves of history, and we have to be a part of making movements happen in history. And I feel that tension surfacing a lot in this conversation, because there's a sense that as much as we want to get in, there's something that's holding us out. What gives me hope is an increasing sense that we are very much a part of the movement of history, which, even though we are seeing very painful fits and starts in this moment that we're living in right now, is very clearly on a trajectory toward a more just and loving society. And when millions and millions of people around the country are taking to the street and saying that we can do better, that we must do better, that human dignity matters. We have to recognize that we are being called into that movement and into this moment. And we're called to be there as Jews, as ourselves, as the best versions of ourselves. And we have a whole history that carries with it what I believe to be one of the most powerful redemptive stories ever written, the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, the idea that a people that is enslaved, oppressed, degraded, can move from degradation to dignity, from darkness to light, from enslavement to freedom. And if we carry that redemptive story that's really built into the muscle system of our community, if we carry that with us when we enter into the movement spaces, then I believe that we have a very powerful message to share, that we can help lift up and affirm human dignity. The way we need to do this is we have to lead with love. We have to lead with an open heart and open mind, even when our feelings are hurt. I've been in this space for 25, 30 years, and it's sometimes very painful. And when I feel the heat rising through my body and I just have that fight or flight reaction that Tema was talking about, I have to lead with love. And I have to understand that we all have the capacity to open our hearts when we want to shut down, and to see each other as human beings, not as opponents or enemies. And that's the work of this moment, which Jews are very much a part of. It's really hard for us. I hope we find the spiritual nourishment and the spiritual strength that we all need. I hope we find the breath that we need to live through this moment. But the trauma that we hold in our system has also positioned us to lead with love and to share our redemption story, not only as a story for the Jewish people, but really as a story for all people who yearn for freedom, who yearn for equality, and who yearn for dignity. And that's where I see our Jewish community leading us in the days ahead.
Leading with love, and hope.
Amen.
Hope is part of the journey. So we're actually at the end of the hour. I want to thank Rabbi Sharon Brous, Tema Smith, and my colleague Seth Brisk. I actually think that we probably could do sort of like a full year course with the three of you just on this topic. There's so much more to cover, and I just want to express my personal appreciation for the discussion we had. And hopefully there are a lot of people out there. I'm just reminded to what Tema said, 15 people in Toronto can make a difference. And everyone who's listening, watching, you can also make a difference. And you can make a difference individually and with the people in your networks and that you know. And so I think all of us have that responsibility because of the importance of human dignity and the importance of recognizing each one around us as being equal and the same. So thank you. Today is our last day of sessions at Never Is Now, and we're culminating with a closing session tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, and we hope that you will join us. And you can always watch sessions that have already happened on the same site. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for being a part of Never Is Now. And again, special thanks to Seth Brisk, Tema Smith, and Rabbi Sharon Brous. Have a good afternoon.